Okay, so in this video, we're going to begin to kind of move into how we form this key compound called ATP. And ATP, we'll get to in a second, very key for cells to do whatever it is they need to do. So in order to do that, though, we need initial substrates, initial fuels to form ATP. Now, if you've had nutrition before, this is like day one of nutrition. So we're going to go way more in depth into these in nutrition class. So most of you will have me for that at some point. But let's kind of go through the basics here. Basically, there are three different substrates that our body generally uses, our cells generally use to form ATP: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And if you've ever eaten food, you know that on most foods, whether it's cereal or ramen noodles or a Kit Kat bar, on there is a nutrition label. And on that label, it says how many grams of carbohydrates, how many grams of fats, how many grams of protein there are. And each of these has a very unique role and a very unique method to which our cells use them to form ATP. Now, having said that, these three also have a wide variety of other different roles nutritionally. I'm not going to focus on that right now. We're just going to focus on the energy part. How our bodies, how our cells use these three for energy. And so let's just kind of real briefly go through each of these just to kind of get us on the right frame as we talk about ATP. Let's start with carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are really the preferred, probably the best term, the preferred means to form ATP. And so when we talk about glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and different things in class, we're going to discuss those using glucose, using carbohydrates as the example, because it is the preferred way to form ATP. It is certainly not the only way. And so if you're one of those people that's on a no carb diet, and we're not going to get into whether it's good or bad, your body will still form ATP. Your body will figure that out. There are other means, there's fats, there's proteins in order to do that. So just a couple things about carbohydrates. These are readily available. They are the most common macronutrient in most foods you eat. Pastas, cereals, vegetables, very high in carbohydrates. Fruits, obviously, as well. And so because of that, there's very common pathways to use carbohydrate in order to form ATP. Now, if you've had me for nutrition, you know that carbohydrates come in three forms: monosaccharide, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The key monosaccharide we're going to talk about is glucose. So when I talk about carbohydrates, I'm often going to say glucose. That's one of the most common monosaccharides. It's not the only one, but it's the one we generally are going to talk about when we discuss ATP. So whenever you hear glucose, think carbohydrate. Okay, so carbohydrates are the first one we're going to look at here. All right, so let's look at the second one. The second one are fatty acids or fats or lipids. Now, these are also prevalent in the diet. Some foods obviously are higher in these than others. Now, we're not going to say fats are good or bad. Fats have a very important role in the body. They protect organs. They play a key role in synthesis in a lot of various reactions. And so they're a great store of potential energy. So we're not going to say fats are bad. One of the unique things about fats, and we're going to see this when we talk about energy and ATP during exercise, is that fats, the stores of these are much greater than they are for carbohydrates in the body. Our capacity to store fat to use as energy is much higher. And that's important because with longer term exercise, we're going to get to this in chapter 4. With longer term exercise, we really don't have enough carbohydrate in the body to use for energy. And so we have to use something else. And thankfully, I guess, we all have fat. Sorry to offend you. We do, some more than others, but enough to be able to form energy from. And so fatty acids from these fats, and we're going to talk more about that. If you've had me for nutrition, you know a lot about fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, saturated fatty acids. So you've heard those. All these are also potential sources of ATP. And the last is proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Now, these are not the real preferred means to form ATP. Your cells can do this, but it's not, proteins are not the most prevalent source of ATP. They're not stored as well, at least readily available for energy in the body. However, we do use these most of the time, not a lot, but we do use these to form ATP. And there are occasions where we may need to use proteins more to form ATP. We'll get to that more in the next chapter. And so we can't ignore amino acids because we can, in some different ways, have methods to utilize these for energy. We'll get a little bit more into that in chapter 4. All right, so let's talk about the most important thing here, ATP. We are going to talk about this a lot. You're going to hear this term literally every class. It is that important. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the key compound that cells require to do a ton of things. For muscle cells to contract, for endocrine cells to bring in certain ions or certain chemicals, things like that. For bones to utilize calcium and phosphate. For immune cells to work and kill things like they're supposed to. ATP is key in allowing those cellular processes to occur. Okay, so we're going to talk about this. You're going to get so tired of ATP, you're going to be like, oh, and you're going to shake your hands, which requires ATP. So let's talk about just two basic terms regarding ATP as we enter into glycolysis in class. ATP is composed of adenine, ribose, which is sugar, and then 3 phosphate groups. And so we often use 2 terms to describe whether we're forming ATP or whether we're breaking down or using ATP. So we often say that if we're forming ATP, which is what glycolysis does, we call that phosphorylation. We are adding phosphates together, 3 of them, to form ATP, phosphorylation. So if we often say, hey, this enzyme phosphorylates, it is helping to form ATP. It's adding phosphate groups to form ATP. Of these 3 phosphate groups here, phosphorylation would add a phosphate group. Okay. Dephosphorylation, let me move that up here a bit. Dephosphorylation would break down ATP. So when our cells utilize energy, when your muscle cells use energy to contract, they are dephosphorylating ATP. They're removing phosphate groups. And that process, the byproduct of that process, is not only separating phosphate groups, is by separating those phosphate groups, you produce energy. Really important. And so these terms, phosphorylation, dephosphorylation, we are going to talk about a lot. And you'll hear these terms a lot. So just remember, phosphorylate, form. Phosphorylate, form ATP. Dephosphorylate, deform, remove phosphate groups. And you're utilizing energy. Phosphorylation, dephosphorylation. And this is key, again, because as we finish up here, cells require energy to do whatever it is they need to do. And so literally every chapter in this book, endocrine system, pulmonary function, cardiovascular system, immune system, even ones we're not going to get very in depth in, nervous system, all of these cells in these systems require ATP to do whatever it is they need to do. And so this is why nutrition is key. This is why glucose and carbohydrates and proteins and fats are key, because they're a source to phosphorylate ATP so that your cells can do what we need to do. And as we'll see in this class, when you don't have ATP available, things go bad. And all of you have experienced this. You've had times where you feel like, I don't have energy. Actually, you don't have enough ATP, or you're not, wait for it, phosphorylating ATP. So we're going to get more into that in chapter 4 when we talk about activity and some of the factors that limit ATP, limit the formation of ATP, that affect the formation of ATP. That'll be the next chapter. But in class, the next lecture we're going to now look at is actually looking at the 3 different methods of forming ATP: creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation, or the Krebs cycle. So that'll be our next lecture.